Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Stephanie Cahoon, co-president of the Friends of the Belmont Public Library. The Friends is a nonprofit organization that supports programming at the Belmont Library, programming like this author's series tonight. Our budget comes entirely from donations made by people like you. Our membership begins at $20. If you would like to join us or donate, the link is available at the Belmont Public Library website. Click on the Give tab. Though the author series has been around for many years, this is our first virtual session. This is one of the bonuses of our new Zoom life. We get to hear from authors from all over the world. We're recording this event tonight, which will be made available through YouTube. Thank you again for joining us. And now to our host, Jenny Alschuler, and our guest, Joyce Maynard. Enjoy.
Hi, everyone. I'm thrilled to be doing this. I actually ran the author series for 15 years and took a 5-year break. So I'm back in the Zoom, very exciting. And I'm thrilled to have Joyce Maynard here. Joyce is a native of New Hampshire, and she first came to national attention in 1972 with the publication of her New York Times cover story, An 18-Year-Old Looks Back on Life, when she was a freshman at Yale. Since then, she's been a reporter and columnist for the New York Times, the syndicated newspaper columnist whose domestic affairs column ran in over 50 newspapers nationwide from 1984 to 1990, and a regular contributor to NPR and national magazines, including Vogue, the New York Times Magazine, and many, many, many more. She is the author of 18 books, including the New York Times bestselling novel Labor Day and To Die For, which were both adapted for film, Under the Influence, and the memoirs At Home in the World and The Best of Us. Her latest novel, Count the Ways, was published in July 2021. Maynard is a fellow of the MacDowell Colony in Yaddo. She is a longtime performer on The Moth, and she is the founder of Write by the Lake, a week-long workshop on the art and craft of memoir that she's held every year since 2001 in Guatemala, where she is right now. She can show us where she is and why she's doing that. But I want to just start, Joyce. You started writing and publishing so young. How did that happen?
Hi, Jenny. Hi, everybody.
Right, everyone's here. So actually, Lauren, now you're pinned at the top.
And maybe I'll begin by just turning my laptop around for a minute so you can get in the mood. I'm sitting facing a very large lake and a volcano. I hope you can see it. Oh, there came a heron right on.
Wow.
So the heron kind of made me forget my question.
So how did you get started so young as you did?
Well, if you knew my mother, you would understand the story. I always begin with my mother, who was a brilliant and passionate and ferociously energetic woman with so much talent and energy and love of language. And like so many of the wives and mothers of her generation, she was born in 1922, got a PhD from Radcliffe, came up from Russian Jewish immigrant origins, lived through the Depression, and after getting all of her education was unemployable in our small New Hampshire town. She sold encyclopedias door to door and tutored Latin for $1 an hour and raised my sister and me to have a different kind of life. So there was never an age when I was so young that I didn't know I was going to have a career. And even before I could physically write, I was giving dictation to my mother. Wow. And she was teaching me. I have to always say at this point, this is not a kind of education that I replicated with my own kids. I grew up in a boot camp of writing, as did my sister Rona, and neither one of us felt we wanted to pass on that tradition, but there was no way to grow up in that house in Durham, New Hampshire, and not know a thing or two about writing, which is actually one of the reasons why I teach, and that's something I do here. I do it to honor my mother in part and to pass on the extraordinary tools that she gave to me. So I started sending off my manuscripts, or my mother did, to Humpty Dumpty magazine, Junior Scholastic, 17. And then when I was 18, the New York Times, with that story that you mentioned, Jenny, that, the irony of that title, An 18-Year-Old Looks Back on Life, was totally lost on me at the time, but it isn't.
Well, me too. I was going to say, it's very rare that I would have an author that I have been reading since you're only 7 years older than I am. So I was a young, mid-teen, young teen when I read the article. Maybe I don't know if I read it when it came out, but a few years later, my mother gave it to me. So I do feel like you've been in my life my entire time.
I can never lie about my age. I'm 67,
Yes,
about to be 68.
right.
I'm indelibly,
18.
Yeah. Well, as having been 18 in
Having
19.
been 18. Yeah, but right, we do know. So you've written both memoir and fiction, and I know that Count the Ways is a work of fiction, but how does your life inform the work in this book?
Oh, I am in all my books, and I think any honest writer will say the same, even if the book is a fantasy or science fiction or but this one is most obviously connected to my life experience and my themes. Count the Ways is the story of a family told over 4 decades, roughly 4 decades, from the early love affair of a couple, Cam and Eleanor, who meet in the late 70s, which was when my children's father and I got together, moved to a farm in New Hampshire where she'd actually already been living, and fulfill this dream of having children, raising children in the country, as I did. A person who knows me or who read my newspaper columns in the 80s and 90s will see lots of similarities. This is not a thinly veiled memoir. It's a fiction. It's a work of fiction, but the theme of the longing to make a family and to make a home comes straight from me.
I was wondering, so reading it, my children are in their 20s and early 30s, but you reminded me of so many parts of being a mother of young children. That I had sort of forgotten. I mean, I remembered when I read it, but I try not to think about it in a way, right? Like, can't think about that all the time. You know what I mean? Like, it's when you're there grown up, and maybe that's another topic.
It's almost like having, I wanted to honor that portion of a woman's life.
Oh, I love that. No, and I was wondering, did you go back and read that? All I was going to ask was, did you go back and read your own domestic affairs, or you could just retrieve that?
Those years, although I had 3, my husband and I were raising 3 children, and then, we divorced fairly early on. So then I was a single parent for many years. They're pretty indelible to me. But the book is not sort of heartwarming stories about little kids.
I know. Oh, I didn't mean.
It's also the story of how the marriage falls apart,
and the difficulty with the young kids. So I wasn't. Yeah, I didn't. It's a lot.
I didn't want to leave the story there either. I wanted to follow this family as the children grew and the reverberations of what they had experienced together. I have written, not in this book, but actually there was a piece that I published in the New York Times this summer about the kind of terror that I remember feeling when I was a young mother of 3 children who mattered more to me than anything on earth, of course. And I knew that my marriage was in big trouble. And in fact, I knew my marriage was going to end. And I was so terrified of what that would do to them. I think this is something many parents go through when a marriage ends. There's nothing that matters more to you than to take care of your child and keep them safe and keep them well. And by this act, which may or may not be a choice, you're going to inflict on them the greatest sorrow they've ever experienced in their lives. That I knew that. And at the same time, there's great sorrow in inhabiting a troubled family. So I wrestled with that one a lot. At the time that my children's father and I parted, there was a very well-known and sort of popular psychologist who was on a lot of talk shows talking about the terrible long-term effects of divorce basically on the lives of children of divorce, children of broken homes for the rest of their lives. And it was, it was a horrifying thing to think that I was going to wreck my children, that we were going to do that. I don't believe that, incidentally. I don't believe that that has to happen. And I don't believe that it did happen in our family, but I have no illusions that divorce doesn't change everybody involved in it forever after.
So how did you decide to like do this as fiction versus memoir? Just to the freedom of changing things?
Oh, I always knew this was a novel. I mean, I've written a lot about divorce, single parenthood, a romance after divorce. I mean, I've covered the territory. My own marriage ended in 1989, so there's been a lot of years of writing about it. But and I go back and forth, as you probably know, between the two genres of fiction and memoir. One of the great things about writing a novel is that you can take the stuff of your life, your obsessions, your themes, the things you know, or the things you want to know. But unlike your life that maybe was not in your control, you can shape it, and you can imagine alternatives to what actually happened. And I made a big point in this book of making sure that the children in this family were not they bear some resemblance to my children, but I shuffled the deck of cards completely, as I did in many ways. One of the children in this family actually is a child who, throughout her young years, is basically, she's depressed. It's not labeled as such, but she's unhappy with herself. She doesn't feel comfortable in her body. And at the age of about 20, she realizes that she is in fact a man, that she makes the decision to transition. This is not a novel about that. What I always like to do is populate my novels the way life is populated, with lots of different stories and situations and characters and problems, the way our lives are. So one part of this family story is the story of Allison, who becomes Al. And the fact that when the mother learns this, slowly recognizes this, which is about the year 2000 in the book, it's hard for her, as it would be, I think, and would really have been to a parent in those years. I think this has been a much more recognized situation and phenomenon now than it was. But and one of the things that I wanted to look at is the fact that what looked like bad news, what looked like a tragedy perhaps, turns out to be good news. Her daughter finally got to be who she really was, her son. There's a lot happens in the course of a family's life. And so this is my longest book, among other things. It's, I think it's, 450 pages, because a lot happens.
I felt like time was almost time itself was a character too in this book.
Yes, time. And, there's both, I had a giant whiteboard in the room where I was writing the whole time. And I had to keep track of how old everybody was and what was going on in the world. What was going on in the world was always a piece of it. When the book, I'm very interested in the intersection of what happens in our houses and what happens outside of our houses that's the backdrop for our lives. When the book opens, the Watergate hearings are going on. And at one point during the pregnancy of the couple's third child, John Lennon is shot, and the 7-year-old Ursula becomes obsessed with Krista McAuliffe and the Challenger launch, which she pins all her hopes on, and then of course we all know what happened. So I filled this book with the things that were going on between 1976 and 2009, and the music and the changes in the world.
It's one of the pleasures of reading the book, actually, I would think for us, most of us having lived through it, but younger people having heard of these things, like it makes you feel like you're living through it. Like the Challenger, we all sort of remember, and it seems in the past, but when you read it in the moment in your book with the little girl so excited going to school that day. And you know, it's just visceral. It just feels like, you know, I saw it again. I felt it again.
That turns out to be the day when she comes home that something disastrous happens in the couple's marriage as well. And there's always that sort of that combination of in the house, outside the house.
Yeah. And it didn't help. You're right. In the sense of, you think about it, like, it didn't help that this had just happened with the challenger, and then the bad news, it leads to the bad, understanding the bad news. Like, it just makes it so much worse.
You know, I feel a need to say, because I'm talking about all these, you know, challenging issues and problems, and that I actually believe this to be my most optimistic book. I know you've read a few of my books, Jenny, so I'm interested if you registered that as well. As many painful events as this family lives through, which probably any family would over the course of 40 years, I wanted to tell the story of a woman who survives difficulty, including some things that she might have thought she could never survive, and she does.
Yeah, no, it does feel very optimistic. It doesn't, even though I realize we are talking about a lot of the things that happen, but it also brings the family together, and even where they draw apart, but then they can get back together. Why did you decide to write, I was wondering, why did you decide to end, like, put, not the very end, but much, you know, almost the end of the book in the beginning, just in terms of technique? Like, why did you do that?
Oh, you know, I don't make sort of conscious technique decisions, but I wanted, mostly the book goes chronologically from when our character Eleanor is very young. Actually, we see her in her own family of origin first, which kind of explains why she is so determined to make a family and to do it better, because she came from a rather cold, distant family, which was not true of me. But before we start at the beginning, I wanted you to have a little glimpse of much later. They gather, the book opens, as you know, with a family wedding, and it's the wedding of Al. I'm not going to give any spoilers here, but you learn this on the first page. Al, the oldest child, born Allison, to his wife, Teresa, on the old farm that used to be Eleanor's farm and is no longer. And once we've sort of met these characters in adult life, I like to think that's going to make you a little bit invested in them, and then you watch them grow up and you watch them live for a while and see how they got to that place.
And I guess when you go back right to Eleanor being like 15, maybe in the beginning, then you're like, you know, oh wow, we're going to really, like, I will invest in this because it's going to be so, we're really going to hear about everything from that.
You know, one of the things that I like, that has been happening with this book is that I have my, I love my readers. I have wonderful readers. I might not have as many readers as John Grisham, but my readers are so loyal and so involved with my characters, and sometimes with me. I know a lot of them. So I've got my old familiar readers who might be, you know, my generation, and, you know, they are looking at this story from the perspective that I am. I'm a grandparent now. I've lived through a marriage, a divorce, a second marriage, a loss of my second husband. But I'm also hearing from young people who are still in the thick of it and who are raising children now. And I hope and I think that this story works for both ends, you know, that you can either identify with the children who have their enormous frustrations with their parents, or the parents who have their frustrations with the children.
And I was just thinking about, like, so just to shift a little bit. So, well, okay, so I was thinking about writing about young people. So when you left Yale in 1972, I guess, right?
I was 18 years old. Yep.
Right. And so you went back 3 years ago, right?
I did.
And so I was just thinking about how that would inform
48 years later.
Wow.
I'm 65 when I re-enrolled as a sophomore.
So
and I should say, I wouldn't be sitting here at this lake talking with you if I were currently an enrolled student. I've taken this year off to write. I'm actually writing a sequel to Count the Ways right now. And although I was a complete full-time student for a year and a half, and now I sort of go in and out. actually, I kind of jumped in. I didn't let you ask your question, but I will just say it's
Oh, go.
Yale is a very different place, and being a student today is a very different thing.
Because I was thinking that only my question. I do want to hear more about what your experience is. Just you're with, like, most people, you know, our age wouldn't spend that much time with such young people. I mean, except for our children, but not in the.
Right.
How was
It's
that?
been a real gift. I should say that, and I think actually it's informed my writing, including this book. I think I just, for instance, the transgender character, the whole, when I was at Yale in 1972, my best friend was a gay man who could never have said he was gay. And now, you know, people are much more comfortably accepted in a big range of sexual choices and identity. I think there's no way to explain my going back to Yale without saying what happened before, which is that when I was 57 years old, after being divorced and on my own for almost 25 years, I made a very good and loving second marriage to my husband, Jim. We were married in the summer of 2013. And a year later, and I really felt that, you know, finally at that age, I had my partner. I had found my partner. I had waited a long time and I had found my partner, and we settled in California and we're making our lives there. And a year after we were married, Jim was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, you know, just about the most brutal form of cancer you could have. 2 years, 19 months later, after a really valiant struggle, a struggle we both engaged in, I would say, and I never really gave up until the very end. Jim died 5 years ago, and really at that point, I was 62 years old, and I had lived with so much loss and sadness. I'd been kind of living in a hospital for 19 months. I knew I needed to throw myself back out into the world and into a sort of hopeful world. And I couldn't think of anything more hopeful than to be around young people. So I never supposed I'd reapply to school. That ship had sailed. I was still paying off my kids' college tuitions, you know, but I applied. They asked for my my SAT scores from 1970, and really I got in. And so I have loved being among young people, and I don't go to their parties, but I actually count many of them as friends, and they'll come over to my apartment for dinner. So it has been a very rich experience.
You know, this is true of you as a reader, and this is the book that she wrote about her husband, Jim, and their.
And I never think of that as a book about widowhood or losing.
That's why I said it that way. Actually, it's about you and Jim.
It's really a love story, and it's about learning what a marriage is. I was rather late to know that, and I'm not sure that I fully understood it until we were fighting for his life. I used to call myself a solo operator, and I had to be so independent for so very long. So anyway, I think in many ways, although what happened with me and Jim is a completely different story from the one in Count the Ways, it sort of allowed me to write Count the Ways, or to get to the place within myself that I could tell this story the way I tell it. I have written about marriage and divorce for a lot of years at different stages of life. And I have to confess that for many of those years, I was still embittered about the losses that we'd all incurred, but certainly that I had. Those were the ones that I knew best. And really, and I had not acquired the capacity for forgiveness. And this book is really about that, as much as it's about love, marriage, family, home, divorce, after divorce. It's really a book that I think I had to be 60 something years old to write, which is to sort of let go of a lot of the old narrative of he did this, she did this, and just look at a story saying everybody probably tried their best. Their best might have been different. Different people might have had a different level of best, but
Right.
and nobody's a villain here. The book begins with the epigraph of this
Yes,
book.
read that, please. Will you read that? Or
I
you know
think
it by heart, I'm sure
I
now.
think I can just say it. So
Yes.
these are 4 lines of a Hawaiian prayer that my daughter Audrey told me about many years ago when she was witnessing me not being particularly forgiving with somebody close to me that I was having a hard time with. And she said, Audrey, who's a very wise person, said to me, Mama, these are 4 lines that you can say in any order. You can shift them around in any order, but if you say them, and this is going to be worth the price of admission, which I guess is free at this library, but I'm going to tell you something that Audrey told me that I think is worth your time here. She said, if you say them in any order to the person you're having a hard time with, things will shift. And the lines are, I'll say them in no particular order. I'm sorry. Please forgive me. I love you and thank you. Very simple, hard to do. It took me quite a while before I actually implemented this plan to say these words. But darned if my daughter wasn't right. That's what happens. Our children start teaching us, you know. So those four lines of that prayer are at the beginning of this book, because this is a book about a woman who has a really hard time with forgiveness, as many of us do for some good reasons. You know, we've been hurt. She, in Eleanor's case, there's I'm not giving away anything here when I say that a tragic accident occurs in the family, and she holds her husband responsible, and she really never can forgive him. And that brings about the end of their marriage, in essence. He does something, you know, he fails, but she fails to forgive. And the part of what I love about writing a novel is that my characters are not static. They're growing and changing. Yeah. So the Eleanor who couldn't forgive at age 35 is very different from the Eleanor we come to know at age 55 later on in the book, which happens to be true of me too. I'm a different person than I was at 35. Big surprise.
Now, one of the reasons that I feel like I know you, aside from all the books that I have read all these years, is on Facebook. After I saw you the first time I saw you in person about 5 or 6 years ago, I started following you on Facebook, and you
I have a very active Facebook.
And I wanted to let everyone know you should follow Joyce, because honestly, and it's not frivolous, it can be, but like you went through the whole time with Jim, like that was on Facebook. So it was
very comforting, you know. It was the place I write. The thing I've done all my life since I was 6 years old was to write, to tell my story. And it was a place that I could go every day. I'm not without my awareness about the issues surrounding Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg, but I have to say it also has served a huge function for me and for lots of people. I'm not showing pictures. No, it's fine if you want to show pictures of your cat. I don't happen to have a cat. But I tell stories from my life, and I don't have to wait 3 months or 12 months for them to be published somewhere. They're there 5 minutes later. So
they're meaningful stories. They're either interesting about your life in Guatemala or what was happening.
I hear back. It's a two-way conversation. I have 5,000 Facebook friends on my personal page, and then I've got an author page, and I try to sort of post things on both. And every now and then I go through those 5,000 people and I think, well, I'm going to eliminate some so some new ones can come in. But, you know, I know most of them in some way. I've met them somewhere. I've gotten a letter from them. I've heard about their child. So yes, Facebook matters. I just posted something. I mean, sometimes they're big, sort of serious stories, and sometimes it's an odd little experience I had 2 days ago. I hopped on a boat and went across this lake and had my hair colored.
I read about that.
Partly for this event, because I had 3 inches of gray at a very unusual hair salon. And I'm actually wearing the hand knit sweater of the brother of the guy at the hair salon today. It was an experience, a hair salon experience like no other, I can tell you.
I'll go find that. So do you ever, I was wondering if you ever, do you go back and use any of these as like notes?
Oh,
or,
no, not
really?
particularly. I think I say this to the one of the things I do, as you know, is I teach writing and I host memoir workshops here at my home in Guatemala. During the pandemic, there were so many unemployed men in this village that I decided I would empty my coffers and hire 30 of them. And we built little casitas all around the gardens here for people to stay, to come and work with me on writing. Some of them are very accomplished writers and some of them have written nothing. But one of my passions, having had my own experience of having had a story that I didn't feel free to tell in my life, a very important story, the story I told At Home in the World, is that I love to help women tell the stories that they have had locked up inside them and haven't been able to tell. So one of the things I say to women who come here is don't feel that you have to hold onto every word so tight. Sometimes you can put them out into the world, let them go, knowing new ones will come. I think we know this about, vegetables in our garden or flowers or, music that we sing. More will come. So the Facebook page posts are sort of my ephemera, but and incidentally, this is the 72nd birthday of my older sister Rona, who is one of the best Facebook posters I've ever encountered. She writes wonderful posts as well. We were both, of course, students of the same mother. And
I guess if Facebook had existed, you could have, the good thing it didn't, or you might have stuck with that in the early, if you were teenagers when that started. We have questions and
I love questions, and please don't be shy and know that I honestly, there's no such thing as a bad question.
So if people want to ask it themselves, you can unmute and just do that.
Okay. Oh, wonderful.
We could have people do that if they want to. And there's one here. It's someone wrote, I noticed many of your chapters and count the ways are short, little gems, vignettes, some ending with the zinger in the last sentence or paragraph. Will you continue with this in your sequel, which the person says they're eagerly looking forward to? Do you view it that way, that's how they
during many of my early years of writing, I was raising 3 children and I was caring for 3 children and I was writing a newspaper column that was 1,000 words. And I had it down that I could write that column during about the length of a child's nap, or as long as he was in, kindergarten before they had to be picked up. So, and I have often kept to this. And I also think I think the forms that writing takes have evolved over the years. Charles Dickens was an amazing writer, but we're not writing like Charles Dickens anymore. So I like those short chapters. I don't consciously sit down and say, I'm going to write a book with short chapters. And I'm not saying that now, but as it occurs to me, the chapter I wrote today, I wrote 3 of them. They were 3 short chapters. So yeah, they're,
the book, although it's long, you said it's long, but I listened to the audio twice.
And I recorded it.
And you did it. No, I know. Well, on Facebook, I learned that you had recorded it, that you were very proud of it. So I thought, well, I will just listen, but I do have the copy of the book. But I was going to say that it doesn't feel like a long book because because of that, it's just each section, you just keep going, you want more, but it doesn't feel long. So does anyone want, I don't know if anyone wants to.
I would love to hear what people have to say, and tell me your name when you're speaking, if you can. Just your first name is fine. Don't be shy. I'm seeing some familiar names here, some friends, some Facebook friends.
I don't know how to ask.
Who is
Who is this?
Me?
Yes, you.
Oh, Robin said
Hi.
Robin. Oh, Robin, I know.
Sure.
Robin has been to this late. Robin came to this workshop years ago. It's good to hear your voice, Robin.
I should have said who it was. I'm sorry. Does anyone else want to ask, or we can? It's hard. It's more awkward than in a real room, obviously.
Oh, yeah. I always think of my writing as a kind of conversation, and I'm only half of the conversation. I sort of need you to be on the other end. So, yeah, by all means, speak up. Although,
Thank you.
This was
Jenny.
a question about
Yeah.
process. Would you talk more about your process? Do you know how your book will end when you start writing?
Never. I do not know where my book ends, and I will tell you any more than I know where my life will end. I know writers who would say exactly the opposite. In fact, Joyce Carol Oates today said she plans the whole book out from beginning to end. I know who my characters are. This is what I know. I know who my characters are. I know what they want, and I know some things that are going to get in their way, that are going to make it hard for them to have what they want. And then I set them loose, and I see what they're going to do about that. And I'm writing a book I want to read, which keeps me going back to my laptop every morning. So this book, I said this afternoon, if you were listening to my conversation with Joyce Carol Oates, I was 20 pages away from the end. This is true of Labor Day too. It's usually true. I didn't have a clue. And I would have been a little worried, except I'd written 9 novels by that time. I knew my characters would bring me to the end. I didn't want to leave you in a place of despair any more than I want to leave you, Elizabeth, in a place of despair. I wanted to get to some form of redemption, but I'm not going to give you happily ever after, because I don't really believe life is that simple. And 20 pages away, I just let these characters do the kinds of things these characters would do. And what do you know? I found out how the book ended. Although, as those of you know who have read it, that ending also left me with certain doors yet to be opened and roads yet to travel. So for that reason, I'm writing a sequel for the first time ever.
Wow. And when will that be expected to come out, the sequel?
I would guess Count the Ways took me longer than any book ever has, 3 years. Sometimes I write really fast. I wrote Baby Love in 10 days. I wrote Labor Day in 12 days. I mean, of course I revise them. I do lots of work. I think long before then sometimes. I would expect that you could see a sequel to Count the Ways in a year and a half, 2 years.
Right, and not to pressure you, but I feel like everyone's going to want to know. Are you writing about your experience at Yale?
You know, I'm going to tell you a story that's really frustrating. I did not go back to Yale to write a book about going back to Yale, but I always assumed that I would write that. And I also thought, oh, that's going to pay for Yale or help. Yep. And I was taking notes all the way along. And as I progressed, I had so much to say about this experience. And wherever I went, people said, oh, I want to read that book. This last winter, I took time off to write a proposal for that book and to write about a third of that book. And I thought it was pretty good and pretty interesting. For the first time in my life, I'm going to admit to you, I didn't sell that book.
Oh, no.
And I actually think I know why. I have 2 books that I didn't sell this year, and both for the same reason. They are no longer politically correct. A book about I'm going to call myself late middle-aged, white woman going to an elite Ivy League institution does not speak to the themes that are most in the conversation at the moment. And those are important themes. And I recognize that it's essential that we're way overdue to talk about race and gender and social justice and inequality and what's going on in Afghanistan and in the streets of St. Louis or Minneapolis or just about any city in America. But it troubles me deeply that other stories may be lost in the process because and I don't actually think that readers don't want to hear about that. I think it's to some degree the gatekeepers of publishing. After I finished Count the Ways, I wrote a novel that I really loved. I was living down here. It was during the pandemic, and I wrote it just in a fever in about 6 weeks. It was a novel about an American woman who comes to Guatemala and in the aftermath of some very difficult events in her life. She's not me in 1973 with Salinger. It's a different kind of thing. And she finds herself, for reasons I won't go into, starting a hotel in a little town like the one where I live in, a Mayan indigenous village. She's a Caucasian woman from San Francisco who starts a hotel. And people come to the hotel. She interacts with all different kinds of cultures, people from around the world. This book, too, is unpublishable in the United States of America at the moment because it would speak of appropriation, cultural appropriation. I'm not writing from the point of view of a Latin person or an indigenous person. I would not dream of doing such a thing. But that book is going to be, if you can read French, you'll be able to read that book next year because it's going to be published in France, but not.
And I feel like the Yale story, aside from, I mean, you left, like I say everyone knows, but people know you left Yale at 18. So there's a big audience of people that aside from one would find it interesting in general that you came back, but just
maybe
like
someday, I don't know.
Right? It would complete the story that people were sort of like, oh, she left, you know. And
I agree. You don't need to convince me, Jenny.
I'm not, I know, but no, I'm just thinking like.
Maybe someday. I have a lot to say about what I learned going back at Yale.
Yeah.
A lot of it not in the classroom, but I saw a question pop up that said, why didn't Eleanor tell the truth? And I have a feeling I know what that question is.
About her children regarding the reason for her marriage ending.
Yeah. There is one aspect to this novel that troubles and infuriates infuriates readers every single time. And it's two pieces to the same thing. And I'm not going to tell you anything that would spoil the book if you haven't read it, and if you, I hope, intend to. After Eleanor's marriage falls apart, her husband falls in love with another woman. She leaves her farm. She is the one who leaves, and she actually gives the farm to her husband, the farm that had been hers, the place she loved more than any other. And this makes readers crazy. And I don't blame you. It's not my goal in writing to sort of keep you calm and happy and have you be turning the pages thinking, this character is making great life decisions. Really, she's such a sensible person. I don't think the world of fiction is filled with those situations. We have to have some bad decisions or some questionable decisions for fiction to happen, for stories to evolve. So I understand why she does this. She cannot bear anymore to live in the place that was the place she dreamed of making her family and being with this man she loved. And now she's not there anymore. You're nodding, Elizabeth. And she has to go. It's a rather impetuous decision, and it's one that will have consequences that she had not anticipated. And she makes a second decision, which is to shield her children from the information about their father's affair. Why does she do this? By the time she has done this, we have seen Eleanor as a functioning the way so many parents do, and I think particularly women, as a woman whose objective is always to protect her children, even at the expense of herself. And she wants to spare them pain. She's the same woman who once, when her daughter lost a Barbie shoe at a birthday party, tore the whole house apart because she couldn't bear her daughter's sorrow over the lost Barbie shoe. And of course, in the process, she incurred a lot more sorrow when her daughter had to see her go a little bit nuts. In the book, I call it Crazy Land. The mother goes to Crazy Land. So yes, it's never my objective to fill my novels with people who always behave the way people are supposed to behave. But she also grows and learns and changes and becomes stronger and ultimately stands up for herself and survives in ways that she was not able to do when she was 30 or 40 or 50. There are some things that I couldn't do when I was 60 that I can do now. It is the gift of age that we pay a high price for. But we do get some wisdom along the way with life.
Yeah, there's a lot of wisdom in the book and a lot of just things to think about for as you said, for people of all ages.
I hope, number one, more than anything else, my objective is always just to tell a darn good story.
It was.
I want to keep you up all night long. I want to keep you turning the pages. I want to, you know, make you cry perhaps, but also get you through to the other end of that. But I also had a lot to say about families and parenthood and love. So that's why it's a long book.
Robin Mencher asked again, will the Cork People appear in your sequel?
Okay, so I have to explain this for
Yes.
probably the majority of people here don't know what you're talking about, Robin, but I'll explain. The mother in this book has a tradition with her children, which is a tradition that I had with mine. Where we lived out in the country, there was a brook down the road, and I used to walk to the brook and the waterfall with my children regularly, as Eleanor does. It's a waterfall that I know you know, Kathy Ferguson. And every spring there would be a weekend when the snow would melt and suddenly the brook would just be racing. And we had a little tradition where we would make little paper boats, and then we would make little people to put in the boats out of corks. And so we would put hair and arms and legs and clothes on these people, and we would name them, and we would put them in the boats, and we would launch them, and then we would run alongside the brook. You know, some of them would make it, some of them would get stuck. We'd, prop them up again, keep them going. And I called them the Cork People. It occurred to me much later that it's a kind of metaphor for parenthood and what we do when we launch our little people into the swirling, churning waters. Where trouble surely lies, and we can't always protect them. And sometimes they get stuck in the weeds, and sometimes they don't even make it. And the Cork People come up throughout the novel in different moments. The book begins with an image of Eleanor and her children making the Cork People. And originally this book was going to be called The Cork People. And in my head, it still is The Cork People. But I was told again and again by people wiser than me about selling books, that you might not buy this book. If you saw a book in a store that was called The Cork People, you might think it was about people from Cork, Ireland. You might think it was about people who uncorked a whole lot of wine. And I said, well, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to make some Cork People, which I did. I made about 100 Cork People, and I took photographs of them, and I sent them to my editor and said, on my book tour, I'll give away Cork People and we'll put them on the cover. But it was decided that the book should not be called The Cork People.
And you tried on Facebook to get people to vote for that.
I didn't try to get that.
I mean, you pointed it out.
I consulted. And
Yes.
that was also enough to make me think. There were some people who loved the title and some people who really hated the title. So I'm happy with Count the Ways. And actually, there's a book within the book, because Eleanor is an artist, and late along in the story, she writes a children's book about Cork People. And the children's book inside this book that she writes, it becomes quite successful.
Would you ever write that book? I know you wrote children's books.
I might. I actually, if you go to YouTube and you Google my name and Cork People, you'll see a little movie that I made with my Cork People in my garden in Guatemala, kind of moving them around. I have a friend who's a voiceover artist in animation in Los Angeles, and he and his daughter made the voices. And one of the young women who was living with me during the pandemic did the camera work. So it's a 90-second Cork People movie.
I just thought of something. Maybe the sequel, you could fight for that if you really care, if you want it. I feel like for the sequel, it might make more sense.
Probably the Corks are further downstream now, but
yes, unless they came back. So we probably should stop here. I'd love it if you could do a little reading.
I would
close us out.
Yeah, I would love to do that, and it'll be very short because I recognize it's a long time to sit in front of a screen. Although I always want to say I can always be reached through my Facebook page or my website, which is joycemaynard.com, and I've got lots of my writing there and different things about books that I've written and pies that I baked. Okay, here we go.
I did a pie class with you too.
I remember. Here is what Eleanor had learned over the years since she'd wept over a chickenpox scab on her daughter's scalp and the bald spot it left there, believing that even that qualified as a heartbreak. The worst things, the ones that actually got you, were almost never the ones you spent your time worrying about. Now here she was with the husband of her youth, down at the waterfall again. They had swum naked in this place once. They had conceived a baby here. Here was the place where they'd launched their boats with the Cork People inside. Here was where Eleanor had witnessed the sight of her husband locked in an embrace with their babysitter. She turned her face to the racing water. Even now, in midsummer, it crashed over the rocks, but somewhere, a mile beyond this place, or 3 miles, or 5, beyond the old people sitting in their cars listening to the radio, beyond the men with their fishing pole conferring among themselves on whether the Red Sox had a chance in the playoffs, and the young couples kissing or smoking weed, and the mothers nursing babies, beyond the teenagers daring each other to jump off the rocks, and the ones, like Eleanor and Cam, just standing there, taking it all in. All those human beings figuring out how to live their lives the best they knew, count the ways. The brook would keep on running, sometimes faster, sometimes slower, but the water never stopped moving. It flowed all the way to the dam in town, and beyond that to the river, which flowed to the ocean, which reached far as the horizon, and even farther than that. Somewhere along this stretch of water, in among the rocks and weeds, so deep under you'd never see them, slept the Cork People. I could take care of you, Eleanor said to the man who used to be her husband. That might be a good idea. They headed up the hill then. No house there anymore, but home.
Thank you, Joyce, so much. And thanks,
Thank
everyone's
you.
clapping.
Thank you all for joining me. I was having a solitary night here by this volcano, and it turned out to be a wonderfully sociable one.
That's
So
the beauty of Zoom, right?
thank you all. Thank you
Thank
all
you.
so much.